Yeah, so thank you very much for coming. Today I would like to talk a little bit about something that was not invented by me, but it was invented by Joanna and Klaus and Chris and who knows some other people, because the title, Food is Like Housing, is not from me. It's actually coming from you and you and you. And I think it's a very good title. It's very poignant and very insightful, because actually I think it's a very good metaphor, and in some ways quite real actually, that housing is like food. You make it yourself or it's very expensive. I think it captures very, very well the same thing in housing. So thank you very much, Joanna, for this very interesting title. I like it quite a bit. And Christoph, beautiful. Wow, what a title. Excellent. Yes, and the contents of the lecture, there are a few points here. One is, of course, the intro that we are doing right now, and then there are going to be 5 questions that also are not coming from me. They are coming again from the same group. I'm not sure who asked what kind of question, but these 5 questions is something that I will answer. I will try to answer, and I could ask very similar questions, but these questions again are not from me. Then this one is more what I'm about. This is the theory, some basic points of the theory that we are known for. It's mostly called the pattern language theory. It's also called sometimes the pattern language theory and the nature of order. But mostly known as the pattern language theory because it's the main principle, if you want, that is known all over the place, and it's used by many, many different disciplines in the world. Computer science, they are crazy about it. They have written 100 books on the pattern language. It's unbelievable, you know. So, and we have invented it in architecture. We have not 100 books about it, but the computer science people, they do. So can you believe that? Good for them. And then I will show some projects that exemplify some of the principles and methods that I'm talking about. And then at the end there will be some final remarks and question and answers if you have some questions. So with that, I would like to go to the first slide. And the first slide is from my table in California, because the food is like housing done by ourselves so expensive. So I wanted to show you how we do it at home, like everybody else does it at home. You cook yourself, because when you go to a restaurant, you pay at least triple or quadruple of the money. And that's why this makes a lot of sense. And housing is very, very similar. So I think I like very much that approach that you have given us. And actually, there's also a pattern in our pattern language book. Some of you know the pattern language book that has been translated into Polish some time ago. And I just talked to somebody who didn't know that. So tell many people that this actually exists in Polish, because it helps you in many different ways when you deal with housing and you deal with buildings and you deal with living and working and lots of other things. And a pattern, you know what a pattern is, or I give you a very simple example here. A pattern is actually an instruction or principle of how to do something right. It solves a problem that repeats many, many times. And a pattern is made up of these 3 elements. It actually is made up of more elements, but these are the essential ones. It starts with a problem statement. Then you have a discussion and an analysis of how this problem can be solved. And then you have a solution to this problem. If you don't have a solution, you have no pattern. So a pattern is always action and design oriented. If it's not solved, there is no pattern. It must be solved positively. It must give you an answer to that question. If it doesn't, you can work for a few more years on it before you find an answer, then it's a pattern. And in this case, communal eating. The problem statement is without communal eating, no human group can hold together. That means if you are family, you don't eat together, probably not going to last very long because at some point that is just not a group anymore. Everybody eats somewhere else, that's not a family anymore, so that wouldn't work. And then you analyze this in detail, why this is the case, and then you find out, well, actually, give every institution and social group a place where people can eat together, make the common meal a regular event. Cook yourself. And then you got a pattern. And then we have about 253 in our book, and there are many, this is the original book, Pattern Language. I don't have the book here, but you can look it up now in Polish. There are many more patterns, but these are the original 253 that we always refer to because that's what everybody knows. And there must be thousands right now in the world in many different disciplines, thousands at least in architecture, because whenever I do a new project, there are always new patterns. You just don't take these patterns, select them, and then you use only those. You have to invent new ones because every project has some problems in it that are not solved by these patterns. So it's always creative. It's always, your creativity is high in demand, and that's how these things continue and create examples of knowledge, of good architecture, of good living, whatever you do, so that you can actually investigate that. And if you find out that this pattern is actually not working well, then you improve that pattern. So it's not only coming up with new, but it's coming up with modifications and improvements of the existing one. And that is actually how knowledge is created in science, in all the disciplines, and in architecture. That is one way of how you create knowledge. For example, if you think, I talked to Klaus the other day, people in architecture invent principles, like Le Corbusier invented the 5 principles, and those could be considered patterns of the modern movement. They didn't call them patterns, but they are principles. And other people developed other principles. So that is how knowledge is created. Very, very important to understand. So with that, probably we should go to the next picture here. So here are the 5 questions that were posed by Joanna and others. The first question is, the battle for the life and beauty of the earth, what is the battle between system A and system B about? Well, it's a difficult question. Not sure if I can answer it, but I will try. Then number 2, product versus process. Huge question, extremely important, because indeed we work a lot with process. Process is a much bigger word for us than product, and that needs to be clarified why that is the case. And that is question number 2. So what is question number 3? How to create bottom-up housing and why we should do it. Very seemingly simple question, not as simple as it sounds to answer. Then we have number 4, how many prototypical solutions and how many personalized solutions? Well, that has to do with, do you buy everything that is mass-produced from prototypes, or is there something that you do yourself? Do you cook yourself? Do you have a garden where you have salad that you prepare yourself? Anything that you do yourself is personalized. Anything that you just consume, that is mass-produced, and that's why this question is there. Then the last question, where to place technology and top-down standards? How can good housing be made with prefabrication? Big question, because so much of building and housing production these days is made from prefabrication. Is that good? Is that bad? But it's part of housing. So we want to answer, or try to answer partially at least, these questions. So let's go to the first one, the battle for the life and beauty of the earth. What is the battle between System A and System B about? Well, first of all, it's actually not a war. Some people think it's a war. It's not a war. And the battle is about how actually to build right organically with people from bottom up, from basic needs and desires, wishes, dreams, if you want, or how much is actually predetermined and just given to you or forced onto you and you can't do much about it. And if you can do this, can find the right way, then you are in what is called System A, which is an organic way. It works really with lots of principles from bottom up. Or you are in System B, where things are actually more mechanical. They are just there for you using. You can't change much. And that is a very simple world in which we are today, because so much more is now produced in mass for your consumption, and you have no real influence anymore on how to actually be part of that. And that's a very simple answer. There's much more to it, but that's a very simple way of how to understand it. And we have fought this battle one time in the case of a Japanese project that I'm not going to show, but I'm just telling you, where we tried to, well, we did actually do the construction ourselves, because then we can actually influence and do something that is coming from basic principles to make right buildings, right landscapes, right site improvements, and so on, right parks and whatever you want. And on the other hand, the big construction industry in Japan, they think that is their right to actually do this work, and you shouldn't do it yourself as you're only an architect, and they don't let you do it. And then they create all kinds of problems, and you have to make sure that actually you still can do it, so then it becomes a battle, and that's the battle that we fought. And we were succeeding. Took a lot of heavy efforts, but it was worth the battle, because then you could demonstrate actually it can be done, and the next person can do it, and then it's not a battle anymore. Then it's much more of you can rely on this experience and say, well, I mean, they did it, and I have the same right to do something from the bottom up than everybody else. So that's what the battle is about. It's not as traumatic. It's not a war. It's a battle about some serious matters in life. That's important to understand. So here's the book. This is describing the battle. And they are very interesting. There are four parts of it. The first part is solving the problem of architecture in our time. That is what the battle is about, to create an architecture. This is based, actually, it talks about a new civilization here that is actually rooted in architecture, that is rooted in very essential, fundamental points of life. And that is what the first part is all about. When you think about, for example, the wasteland in our hearts, that's a very interesting chapter, because it talks about all the things that you cannot do because you're restricted. And you are longing for some real good life, and you can't do it because there are all this restriction, that restriction, you can't do this and this consumption. And it's an important chapter on a psychological basis. What's going on in you if you want to have a fulfilled life and you can't fully do it. And that's what that is about. And so then the part two is about rumblings of a coming battle, because when all these problems are happening, you start to feel, well, I mean, I need to free myself. This is crazy what's happening. I need to be much more liberated and do something that is based on principles that I can believe in, that I can work with. And then you start to liberate yourself in some form. Talk to Mike. Oh. Yes, sorry, I will put this away, because when you have two things in your hand, it's hard to do this. Okay, so you see the rumblings of a coming battle, and that is where it starts to be starting little skirmishes, where you have problems with some people, they are doing this, and you start to fight against this. And you then slowly notice, well, you can actually succeed. So that's what the second part is about. Then the pitched battle. This is where it gets heavy. That's real battle. Then you get really into serious battle. And I had a very good understanding with, well, let me put it like this. First, the site work in all its glory we could do ourselves. We were making sure that we did this ourselves. And that was very successful. And but when it got to the construction of the buildings, then the Japanese construction industry, they actually succeeded. They pushed us aside and we had to fight our way in again. And in the end, we did it together. I did it my way. They tried to do it their way, and we were fighting pretty much every day. And the construction manager from this big construction company and we agreed during the day we fight, in the evening we drink beer together. And that was a good way of actually surviving this, because otherwise it's hopeless. You know. So there have to be some ways of doing this in a way that is human. And when you go to the last part 4, that's the groundwork for a new civilization. So that tries to show when you can create a civilization that can actually liberate itself in a form that it creates a new culture, a new civilization that works together in new ways, then you start to look into something that maybe is possible. So this is big philosophy, a big story, big wide thinking, and for that reason it became a very well-known book, and it gives you some hope, especially in architecture and in the making of housing. Now, when I get a little bit more practical here, this is the modifications in the operating system we are now in. These points here are sort of more regular process that we do in architecture. You do the master planning, the engineering at grade, and so on. And we know all of this. All architects know what they're doing. But it's all technical. There's no humanistic aspect in there that makes any reference to any quality. It's just all you have to fulfill mechanical quality if you want. Well, that's not quite enough, you know. That's not in our world today. So we have to add some other dimensions that works together with this, because we have to do this anyway, but it also changes that. And the first one is architecture as an art of making. It's not an art of computer drawing, it's an art of making and building. You have to get your hands dirty, you have to learn how to actually do this yourself, and then suddenly it opens up possibilities that you cannot do with paper alone, and you cannot do just by using the mouse and the computer and making drawings that nobody can even really fully understand. They look good, but you never know what's really behind it. And another principle is changes in human system, coordination of interested people and skilled workers. Now here we are deeply into housing, because that is something you need to do in housing in order to make sure that people get what they want, and in order to make sure that actually this is lasting for a long time, creates identity, creates space, creates people's deep connection to their world they are in. So that's an important principle. And then there's a new approach to management of money. Well, we were talking before about the, not in this lecture, but with some people here, about the grassroots principle, grassroots for housing, where you actually try to avoid to have to take a loan and pay interest that is as much as you as the house was worth, but the bank never shows you really what the cost is. And when I look at my house in California, I paid at least the same amount as it was with the original cost. That means all the money goes into the bank loan. It doesn't go into the house itself. It could be improved, it could be, and so that to avoid that is a very, we talked about this, I talked with Michel about that particular way. And this is not so easy, because we are not used to that. You need to be organized. Normally you get a loan and then you pay it. And that's it. So that needs to change, that more money gets into the house itself, and maybe you need a little loan, but you don't need these huge loans that make you be a slave all your life. I mean, that's essentially what that means, you know. And if you're rich, it may not mean much to you, but we are all not rich, and it affects us all. So that needs to change a little bit. actually needs to change dramatically. And we also have to respect the fragility of human beings. That means we have to take care of the old, the kids, the small people, the homeless, we have to take care of that. We also need to create housing for them, make their lives bearable and worthwhile. The same is true for respect for all animals, meadows, plants, green, taking care of the ecological side of the world, creating sustainability, working with regenerative systems. So that's what that means. And land and nature as generator of form. The generator of form is not built on your own thinking, what you want to create, being a great master of something, but you're trying to be similar to nature in a way that you look at the land, you look at the sky, you look at the ground, you look at everything that is there, and then you build it on that particular situation. Every architect knows the first thing you do, you look where the sun comes from, So that's it means to work with nature, but extend this to a much larger degree. And then you apply a generative process. And the generative process, the most simple one, is based on, I introduced already the pattern language, and that goes together with participation. That is the most simple form of doing that. And there are other kinds of generative processes, more expanded ones, but this is the most simple one. Because a generative process is defined as rules, parameters, and other conditions that together work and create a system that generates through interaction something through whatever, patterns or other principles. That's what a generative system is. And the most important for all of this is your psychological spirit, your understanding of improving the world and understanding the world in its wholeness. Somebody was using the word harmony before. That is very, very important, because if you have no positive view of the future, of how to do things, you cannot do that. It may be very difficult. You still have to have a very positive, you may be fighting, and that's all fine, but you have to have a positive attitude and make this right. And then you can do it. So this is very important. So those two things have to work together. And in some ways, if you want, this is another expression of the battle. This system and this system are fundamentally different, but if you put them together, then actually you have something that will create great architecture and improves the life of people. And that is actually explained on page 6 to 8 in the introduction of the book. Does anybody have the book here? I don't have mine here. We don't have the book here, no. No. I have it at home in my hotel, so I should have brought. Anyway, so food is like housing, done by ourselves or expensive, product versus process. Well, that's a big topic, because most of us think in terms of products, especially when it comes to architecture and buildings. The general contractor, he produces a product, and the client buys a product. But what is much, much more important is that you think in terms of process, because the process is much larger, much longer than any product. Change is happening all the time, and products are just temporary situations of processes, because they change again, and they change again. And if you think in terms of process, you are much more clear about how to actually include products within that process. And when I look at some processes, let's just look at some here. I showed this morning in another lecture. If you look at the growth of a flower, that's a process, but it's a short period of time. But even that short period of time, you can see what I call, and Gustav Alexander calls that so too, what's called an unfolding wholeness, an awakening of space but first of all an unfolding wholeness. And when you think about that process at a much larger scale, this is the flipping of a pigeon. The wings are flipping. Takes less than a second. It's a process. When you photograph it in detail, you see, well, this happening, that happening. It's a process that you can analyze. And once you understand it, you can build a helicopter or an airplane after that, because you understood something, how nature works, and then you try to imitate that. But when you look, for example, at a much larger process, this is a solar system changing over 2 million years. These are lots of stars, but this is a whole system, and then it changes its form from a circle to an S, and then it starts again and makes a ball, and then it goes in maybe the same process again or makes another shape. That's a huge process. And the process of building and designing is much longer than this process. And it's also much longer than the flower that I showed you. But you can take these processes as examples of how you can create your process of creating buildings and designing, and find a way of defining this so that it has its own value and sequence within your own work and your own existence. Because our process of life is 80 years now, and within that we deal a lot with housing and with architecture and many other things. So that's why process is for us extremely important. And products is also important, but they are the secondary elements within a process. They are parts of the process, actually. That doesn't mean that products are very important, because you have to finish your deadlines when you build a house, when you have to get the permit and so on, but it's part of a larger process. So that's my short answer to that much bigger topic. Here you see, for example, how that can work. This is in urban design, how a sequence of buildings are coming. This is in a model. This is first a little kiosk, and then this is at the San Francisco waterfront, and then in a sequence, suddenly without a plan, something emerges of an urban structure. And how it works is that the rules make this urban structure, but there's no plan. There's no drawing, there's nothing. There's a sequence of rules that tell you what to do, but you have to interpret it. There's no mechanical solution to it. You have to actually do this in a way that you could create this unfolding wholeness that I'm talking about. It's just another example in terms of urban design. You get this kind of structure out. And they have written a book about this. It's called The New Theory of Urban Design. But I'm not getting. This is another way of, you see it in a drawing. So this is the bandstand, the kiosk starts here. And then when this is done, then you have to look at the situation and have to make a new proposal based on this is there and this is there. Now, if something else would have happened, you cannot make the next proposal. So your new proposal is always dependent on what somebody else has done before you. And if you do this right, then you can develop an urban structure in a totally new way without any plan, without any master plan. The master plan is in the process. And we, as I said, we have written a book about this. And that is a very interesting, highly advanced way of doing things. But I'm not sure if we are ready for that, because it may be a little bit too advanced, but it's highly appreciated by many people, and you can do it yourself, because we understand it, how to do this well, and that is a process in urban design. How to create, number 3, how to create bottom-up housing and why we should do it. Well, you should do it because, or we should do it because you can provide housing for many people, or people can even provide housing for themselves if they have the ability and right to do it by themselves. This is an example of a project in Mexicali, in Mexico, where we worked with lots of families, and they were not only designing with us on the ground. Actually, this is done on the ground, the design. It's not done on paper, it's all done on ground. And then they also build. And by building themselves, they can own a house. In this case, they had to also take some few thousand dollars of loan, but it actually was a very small loan. Even that is difficult for them to pay back, but with their labor and with their ability to actually contribute to the house, they actually got equity in the house. That's why you should do it, because actually there are other ways of paying a loan. A huge loan that actually takes your lifetime. This takes only 2 years or so, even less, and you have a house, you know. So that's a good reason for doing it. And in developing countries, it's much easier to do that because people build on their own anyway, illegally. So you may as well do it legally and then make it easier for them to do it in a way that it works, you know. So that's a good reason to do it. And I think we should find ways also in advanced societies like society here, where you can actually find a way to do something like this in a transformed version. I'm not saying that you should do exactly that, but there are ways how you can contribute to making a building, making an apartment building, so that you can then start to own it. You get credit for it, and that's how you partially pay your house. Otherwise, you don't get a house, because you may not have enough money. But this is a way of actually doing that. So that's very important reason for doing that. Other than the fun of it, I mean, there's a lot of fun of this. Doing this, it's an enjoyment. You can work with colors, you can create walls, you can create your interior, you can do a hell of a lot of stuff that is actually extremely creative. So don't look at it as a burden, you know. It's hard work, and so I know, I mean, concrete is heavy. When you put it on your shoulders, you have to carry it up the ladder and then create a floor. But there's a lot of fun in it. If you don't, I mean, I said before that the first principle is that architecture is an art of making. Well, enjoy it as such. If you only see it as some heavy work, well, then not worth doing, you know. So I think you should put the two together. You get some housing, and you enjoy it, you know, and then it's totally worth it. This is an example of a project by a colleague of mine in South Africa, Hajo Neis, where he provided basic elements, and then people who were also coming in there, they built their own part in the middle, and there you got a whole street full of this stuff. And that is a way where you pay for the part, or the government may provide with subsidies these pieces, and then you build in between. You actually do something yourself. So half is organized through government procedure or whatever NGO procedure, and the other half you do. And then you get something that is more rigid, but the other half is more personalized. And then you get a structure that is actually worth doing, and it's actually a lot of fun. And if you, this is the next question, how many prototypical solutions and how many personalized solutions? That means how much should be provided. Like here, this is provided. It's not personalized yet, but this is personalized. This is how much of that? So here it's half-half. So that's the answer in this case. And actually, when you look at a more famous example that you are all familiar with in recent times, this is Alejandro Aravena, and he provides three-story structures in regular form, and then people build in between. Same idea. Hajo Neis did it a long time before Alejandro Aravena, but same idea. And it's personalized. Look, this is regular, same, built by, let's say, built by the government, and this is what the people build. And the two together still make this very personal, even though half of it is purely built in mass production by the government, let's say, but the other half you do what you want within the rules that you have established. That's a good way of doing things. Can you do something similar here? Maybe. Maybe not to that extreme, but some kind of initiative that you can contribute might be possible. I would not exclude it. This is a shelter for the homeless that we built in California, and almost everything is personal there. Now we try to include the homeless themselves to build with us, but that was too much. They are just not capable at this point of doing that because they need also have mental health care and other things. But if they could have, if they wanted to, so we had to do it ourselves, but it's all very personal. There's, again, nothing that is, even when you look at the tiles here, each tile is different from the other, but from the distance they look the same. But you see there's some difference in all of them. I show that later when I show the project in more detail. This is just an example here of how much is personalized and how much is provided by prefabrication or mass production. Here you see, for example, how the column is developed on our builder's yard. CS is the organization that bears our name. It's called Center for Environmental Structure, and Chris Alexander is the president of that, and I'm a director of that. And this is an example of how you experiment in the builder's yard of how this thing would be built. So it's very personal, and here you find out what's not so good and what to change. And in the end, once you have it right, then you build it in real. So even the builders are doing very personal work because they want to get it right in a way that is not prefabricated. It's actually worked on and make it it's personalized. Very important to understand. Or here, since the question is also what the large standards are, how they are affecting the buildings themselves. This is an apartment building that I did with Chris in Tokyo, and there was one problem that the windows, some of them are supposed to be other than wood. We wanted to do it all in wood because the owners, the users wanted to have a feeling of wood, but some of them you cannot do, and then some people were suggesting, why don't we have it all in aluminum? These are aluminum windows. But that would have created a very uneven feeling. It wouldn't have the touch of, well, you felt good about the wood, you know. It made just the right contribution. So we just only selected the ones that had to be absolutely by law in this one. The others stayed wooden decisions. So that is how you can handle big, one little example of how you handle big regulations, building law in a way that you still have something. If the overall feeling is still good, no problem, you know. A few aluminum windows, you don't have to get too worried about that. So this is the last question. I just gave you one example with the Japanese apartment building. Where to place technology and top-down standards? How can good housing be made with prefabrication? Big, big question. BGKN is right now developing, can I say that, or is that good? I can say, maybe it's a secret, about prefabrication and how that can contribute to the huge national housing project in Poland. Well, that's a big thing, you know. It's supposed to be all prefabrication. Well, I mean, I'm not sure about that. So I would like to have some of the humanistic principles in there that actually make the technical side go together with the human side. And the human side is quite often forgotten because you can't really fully get a handle on it. I mean, there's no monetary value with it. But the technical side always costs money, needs calculation, needs to do this, it needs to be done, clear. But what about the human side? So that's why it's a very interesting question. And let's look at some examples. What do you think about this example? This is, as you can see, in Las Vegas. And it's extremely technical. You know why it's so technical? Because there are only streets. Most of the area are streets, you know. And you have to use cars. You can't even walk longer to another place because it's all done by streets. And the houses, they're all pretty much the same. And they don't even look like houses. It's one thing the same after the other. So that's mass. That is not prefabrication only. It's mostly mass production, which is the larger term in which prefabrication can be embedded. But that's a problem. You may not want to live like this. I don't. But many people have no other choice because that is affordable. And that's what they buy. And you can see this all over the place in the United States. Many, many areas are like this. This is another interesting example from Chile. Everything the same. Boom, 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 boom. You can go on forever. It's so much the same, you know, you don't even find your house, you know. There's no way because so some people are at least clever enough to make it colorful so that you find your house. And if you are in a blue zone, maybe this one, well, you may not find your way because this is also blue, you know. So it's a problem. I mean, this is like a caricature of mass production because, I mean, that may not work in terms of human life, but it's affordable. You can pay it, but still you can do a lot better. I mean, that's not good enough. This one. What do you think about this one? Is that something you want? Is that good for mass housing, for something that you would like to live in? Probably not. I don't think that's a good idea. So this is not a very good example for where prefabrication is successful. This is an example in Berlin, Hellerhof. So you can see this is not an easy question. There are lots of issues that go, and how to make it better. I mean, how do you have to learn how to make it better? That's even a much larger issue. Now you can also, of course, if you have a lot of money, we can do it like this here. This is a project in New York where the steel structure then has whole units of housing. This is a whole unit of a housing, a long, narrow apartment that's being put up there and set into the structure, and then you get something like this here. That's how the housing looks, and that was built just 3 years ago. That's expensive, so that we can't all afford, but in New York, people can afford this. That is prefabrication in an expensive way. So this may be interesting, but we can't afford it. Another example is the solar settlement in Freiburg. There are a lot of prefabricated elements within there, as we know, but it's put together in a reasonable way, and I think the idea of having a sustainable energy saving and producing village makes a lot of sense. So this is a reasonable solution for these days, but it's also not very cheap. So how do you find something that is cheap enough, inexpensive enough so that you can afford it? That's the trick, of course, in all of this. And that is what Chris Alexander also would like to help you with. He is the father of the philosophy that I'm telling you a little bit about, the pattern language philosophy, and in a larger sense, you can call it the organic theory of architecture and urban design. That's maybe a better term for understanding this. And he cannot be here today because he's now very old, but he lives in a nice house in England, so he has no problems with housing. And he gives you his best regards to be successful in your attempt to get good housing in Poland. So with Chris, I would like to explain you a little bit about the fundamental question that we address in our work, in our research. Pretty much anything is determined by that. And the three fundamental questions are very simple. So if you hear the word research, theory, all of this, sounds very big. These are very simple research questions you can apply almost to anything. The first question is, what are good structures? That is something that we look at all the time in our daily life. What is a good chair? What is a good camera? What is a good computer? Apple, of course. What is a good, what are good classes? That is something we deal with all the time. That's the most simple question that we have to ask every day, many, many times. But the second question is a hell of a lot more difficult. Because the second question is, what is a good process? Or what are good processes? Well, that gets difficult because then you have to think in sequences. You have to think in terms of how you put together something. If you follow those steps, then something good will come out of it. So you can already see it. Then there are many things that, it's not one thing, I look at one thing, is this good or not? But you have to think in terms of process where many things can happen. So you can already see why process is so much more important, and that's why this question is really the more important one. And of course, when you put the two together, then you ask the question, what are good processes that create good structures? So then the process has to be good and the structure has to be good. Maybe you have a good process that creates a bad structure. Well, that can't happen because then it can't be a good process, So that's getting complicated. But they are, in essence, when you look at them, three simple questions. And in any research we do, some of these questions will come up in some form. And you can do the same thing. And you do it anyway, but mostly with regard to structures, to products, you ask that question, the first one. You don't ask really the second and third one. When you do sports, you play tennis or soccer, you know what good processes are because you have to dribble and you have to give a ball. I mean, that's a process. You have to know how to do that. So there are many ways of how you can understand what this is. Or you do garden and you have to deal with the garden in a way that you have to do certain things at certain times. Then you are in processes. So life is full of these processes, and structures are simple temporary things that appear at certain points within the larger process. So that's very, very important to understand in terms of what we and how we do this. So there are many books that were written. These are not all of the books, but there are quite a few books that deal with housing. This is an early book, Houses Generated by Patterns. And that deals with the United Nations FAMI Prevy competition in 1969 in Lima in Peru, and the whole settlement was built with, at the time, proposals by famous architects like, that's when Chris Alexander started his career, and his project, or the CS project, was also accepted and built. And the biggest, most important book that deals with many things, but also with housing, is this one, the pattern language, and that has been translated now in Polish. And Michał has a copy. He showed this to me the other day. Are you the only one who has that copy, or other ones who have that copy? Do you have the copy? Who has a copy? Oh, you have a copy too. Do you have a copy, Klaus? Two, in Polish. Great. So quite a number of you actually have that, and then you can work with this. I mean, don't let it just sit in the library. To do something with it, or develop your own pattern language for some project. Another book that deals with housing only is this one. This is called The Production of Houses. So this is this is about sequences. When production, that's a sequence, a process, and this, of course, it's a new theory of urban design. It deals with housing. This is more urban design, and it's the nature of order, which has it's Chris Alexander's big final work, And in book 3, you have lots of projects. That's the biggest. It's like this thick. I think the 4 books are like 3,000 pages. You know, it's like a monster book, but it's very, very interesting and deals also with lots of housing projects. Now, in this work, reported in many of these books, creates of law, of course, a lot of principles that I have written down. Some of you, they are meta principles, they are primary principles, there are other principles and techniques, methods. This list is endless. This covers maybe 1/5 of all the principles. Even that is maybe not enough. And I'm not talking about too many today. I'm talking mostly about the participation and pattern languages. Adaptation is a very important topic because if you can, we talked about this already, if you cannot adapt your own, whatever it is, your apartment in ways that it really fits you, then it's a mechanical apartment. It's not really personal. You need to be able to do adaptation at the local level. And we have talked about this a little bit. And the other one we have talked about is the generative design and building sequences, because process has to be understood and formulated in ways that you can handle it. And a generative process or regenerative process too are ways of understanding what it means. Because we don't know many of these processes. You know it best, of course, in cooking, because you have to follow a recipe. But in order to do it really well, you have to invent something. You have to be creative about it. And then you get into adaptation. Otherwise, you just follow somebody's recipe. So that's why the generative process is highly important. Now let me explain to you the 3 main phases of our work, how they came also in a sequence of how things were discovered one after the other. The first phase is the pattern languages. Many projects have been done in that way. And of course, it's not only pattern language, it's a lot of principles that go with it. And that's around since about 1966, I used the 1970. And these kinds of projects with pattern languages, they are going on, and they are not only done in architecture, they are done in many different disciplines, in computer science, in social psychology, in product design, in many social sciences. So I know lots of people who do this, and we have conferences about that. I organize a conference every 2 years in America, and other conferences are happening in Europe. And so that's what the pattern language phase is. The second big phase is this one. This is about the generative design and building processes and sequences, and they are around since about 1990. And I showed you some with the urban design process. They are all about sequence, how you organize sequences so you can actually get a good structure together. And that, we do a lot of projects there. And I will show you a few more examples when we get to some projects. And the latest development that we have since 2005 is the Generative Urban Code. And that is a process that deals not only with the principles of design and construction and building from the point of view of the architect, the user, and the builder. It also talks about the elements that are needed in a larger scale so that this actually works. And that's called what we call procurement, and some of you are very familiar with that. That means you have to make sure that land is being bought so that actually you can do a building, because the house has to stand somewhere. It has to do with the law has to be changed because the law may be old-fashioned and not even working anymore in many ways, so that you can actually build not this huge staircase, but you have to do it smaller. We have this problem in California. We have to do staircases that are unbelievably big, and actually there's no need for it in private houses. So that has to do with procurement. And that is very, very important because the world has become so complicated that you also need to include procurement now in the process. Because you might be very idealistic and you say, oh, I want to do it this way, I want to build my house myself, and then there's a law that you're not permitted to do it yourself, you know. So you've got to change the law. And that's a matter of procurement, and that's what the Generative Urban Code is working with. So that is getting more into what the project, the National Housing Project in Poland is about, because that needs a lot of procurement, but it also needs a lot of good principles to actually do good work. That's why this is very closely related to the current project in Poland, but it also permits, of course, to do this as well. That does not go away. This can always be done because that's still existing. So those are the three big phases that we have experienced in our own development. And if you look at it in terms of projects, you can say part A, part B, part C. And part A would be the patterns, part B would be the processes, and part C would be the urban code. But I think I'm going to show one or two of these projects in a moment. But first I want to explain a little bit more about pattern languages, because that's such an essential thing that you really should understand that well. This is the book, A Pattern Language, and it deals with towns, and these are the number of patterns that are related to that. It deals with buildings, pattern 467, page 467 to 931. And then it deals with construction, and some other people divide it even more further up, but essentially towns, buildings, construction. And when you look, for example, at the first 10 patterns, one deals with the whole world. It's called independent regions. It's a very interesting pattern, because it tells you how you can be independent as a country, and that makes sense. And then you go into the region, and you go into the city. And I think maybe I have a few patterns here that I can... Yeah, there are a few patterns. Pattern number 2, city-country fingers. Yesterday we went to the south side of Warsaw, and Chris showed us the city-country finger pattern in action along the streets where all the buildings were and the valleys which were full of agriculture. And if you continue that pattern, then sooner or later Warsaw will be a city with city-country fingers. The most famous example of city-country fingers is the 5-finger plan of Copenhagen. They did this very early, and they have exactly like this. That's why I call it 5-finger plan. This is the city, and this is the countryside in between that goes to the center of the city. So that's in order. That's a very good pattern for a sustainable ecological plan. And if you go to pattern number 8, which says Mosaic of subcultures, that pattern is very interesting, that you have a multicultural society. When you go to San Francisco, there are lots of mosaic of subcultures. There are the Chinese, and there are Italians, and there are the Vietnamese, and there are the homosexuals, and there are all kinds of different cultures, and it's an incredible rich variety of life. But when you are in a more monolithic culture, that is maybe then the mosaic of subcultures has more to do with particular professions or particular interests. But San Francisco is just a rich city with lots of subcultures that actually, these are pictures also from San Francisco, of a pattern that I like very much, because the city that we have too often that is too heterogeneous, that means everything is the same, is not so interesting. On the other hand, you don't want a ghetto either. Ghettos are bad because it's can't get inside, and there are barriers that really are not good. You need a mosaic of subcultures, but it has to be open. Everybody can use it so that it's productive for the city. And San Francisco is one of the best cities with regard to that. And London is a good city for that. They have a lot of mosaic of subcultures. So has Paris. But then if you go to Kuwait, for example, I went to Kuwait in last December. That's more heterogeneous, more monolithic. So you don't have a mosaic of subcultures. But this is one of the patterns that I think really liberates society in a social way. So patterns are social as well as spatial. Everything we do is of course spatial because we are architects, but it's also social because without the social part you're not really changing anything, then you're just making space in a cultural sense, you know. So that's why many of these patterns are either social or spatial or both together. Because we are architects, we are not social scientists. Joanna is social scientist, she can write social patterns, we write spatial patterns, we can write social, spatial patterns together. Oh yeah, this one is, I showed this to you already, the communal eating. And then we go to smaller patterns, window place, sunny counter, and so on. So the one category, or one criterion, there are two main criteria for patterns. One is the pattern has to be true. It has to work, it has to be tested, and at least by 25 people, so that statistically it's valid. So it has to have a quality, without that it cannot be a pattern. And the other important category is the second one, which is this one, and that means all patterns have to be connected to other patterns. So this is an example of all people everywhere, which is a pattern, because all people have the right to be everywhere. And they are connected, of course, to children, because all people and children belong together. So that works, but they're also connected to a vegetable garden, because all people like to be in gardens. So you can actually, this is what's called a pattern language, because you create with patterns a language. In this case, to observe something, but mostly in order to create something. So it's these two categories. One is the quality of a pattern, and the second one is it's all connected in a pattern language. So pattern language is also a generative system or process defined as a combination of principles, parameters, and rules that interact and work together to form or maintain a system, a structure, an organization, cities, buildings, parks, and gardens. So now you can understand why so many other disciplines use it, because it's a very effective structure to quickly organize anything. And that is the huge success of this theory and this book. And when I tell you that this is the most sold book in modern times, more than 500,000 books have been sold. That's pretty amazing for an architecture book, because normally architecture books don't sell that many copies. And here are some other books that go with it. The Oregon Experiment is where these patterns have been applied. So let me just show you how this works. So if you want to do it yourself, you can look at patterns that are there, like the pattern 43, university as an open market or network of learning. And this is a process that the University of Oregon applies to all their buildings, all their planning since more than 50 years. It is extremely successful, and they are working with the 6 principles. The first one is organic order, so everything has to grow organically. The second one is participation. The third one is piecemeal growth, so that's a process pattern. One thing happens after the other, and not everything together in a way that it creates chaos. The next one is patterns. The next one is diagnosis. You have to analyze everything before you do something new, so you don't do too much mistakes. And then the last one is coordination, so that different projects actually work together, create this network that I just was talking about. And those are the 6 patterns used in the Oregon Experiment. And I consider these 2 the most important, because they are happening over and over again. And the others sometimes are more important, sometimes there are others that are relevant. And as you know, a university in the United States is like a little city in the city. All of this is the University of Oregon, 30,000 students, and the city itself only has 130,000. So this is 1/3 of well, a little less, but about 1/3 of the population of Eugene. And all of their design and construction is done according to the pattern language approach. And how you do it, if you want to do any other projects, for example, this is the application of the principles. You can take some patterns from the pattern language book, the original one, but then you have to create also new patterns, because in any project that you do, you always develop new patterns. You don't just take patterns from there and apply it like in a cookbook. That's a no-no. You always develop some new, you are creative, and make something out of it that is appropriate to your project. Because each project is different. And otherwise it becomes like a mechanistic application, which is no good. I mean, that we don't want to do. And then, so you have the patterns from the pattern language book, and then you have patterns specifically developed for the Oregon campus plan. And then the two together, they make the pattern language for the university. And this is the campus plan that shows you policy and pattern framework. This is what they are still applying in their planning of the university, and everybody has to follow it. And it's a very successful way of how this is applied in a larger urban project. One of my students was actually developing this project, well, now he's a professional, so that he could, and he combined here's the pattern language for this project, and today there's also lots of sustainable elements that go with it, so those things together create this new project, and I don't have any other pictures here, but it's actually a very successful building that was just finished a year ago. So you can see how it works in many different ways. And at the end, I have just a few, so this is a little bit of the theory of overall and the theory of patterns, so that you have a little crash course in that. And now I just show you a few projects, how they are done. This is a project that goes right into the Oregon experiment, and that's a project that I have done with Chris Alexander. It's a student housing project. It costs $62 per square foot, or cost at the time. That's very cheap. And it was for family student housing. So family of students can get small apartments in there. And this is the site plan and the site model. And there's one particular element that I explained this morning. Maybe I explained it again, even for people who were seeing this morning. And that is that when you look at the arrangement, you think that all the buildings are the same. Well, they are in terms of an archetypal structure, but they are not in terms of a pheno structure, because they're all different. The length is different from this length, this width is different from this width. Here, this is the same thing. This even here, you move this over here. So they are in terms of their archetypal structure the same, but they're totally different in terms of their phenological structure. Everything is different. There are two apartment types within there. One is the long and narrow apartment. The other one is the thick and centered apartment. And when you look at this, nothing is the same again. This apartment goes into here. Here it's doing this zigzag. And that is the nature of an archetypal structure. This morning I used the example of your face. Like your face, let's say your face is the archetypal structure. My face is the phenological structure. So your face is not the same as his face. So your face is also, like mine, phenological structure. Same with you. Everybody has the same archetypal structure as Derek in an idea, but they're all different. All your faces are different. That's a law of nature. So we apply this law of nature within the building structures that we do. When you look at trees, all the leaves look the same. When you go close, they're all different. That's a very subtle principle that you can apply in many different ways, but that is something that takes a little bit more work, but it's actually very important because it is based on a process and a principle in nature that you can be very proud of, because it actually is it's a form of adaptation to a particular kind of local situation. That's the principle of adaptation in the larger sense again. And when you look at this is the finished project. It's right at the edge of the university. This is actually university athletic ground. And there's one pattern that you all might easily understand, because it was very important for the students to have their own entrance, even if it was to the third floor, own entrance with staircase going up all the way. They did not want to have staircases that they had to share together. And it was very important to them, so we did this, even though it's a little expensive, but it worked out in terms of space, and so they wanted to have all their own entrance. Well, if that's an important pattern, you have to do it, you know. And it worked out quite well, and that's a very simple way of listening to users so they get what they want and they stay happy, because if you don't do it, you lose them. You lose their interest. You have to, important things have to be done. And you have to continue to work with the users in ways that is happening. If you don't take them seriously, you lost them. So that's extremely important. When I talk about participation, I mean it. And because if you don't do it, then of course people see, well, it's not for real. It's just lip service, you know. So it needs to be a real process. And then it works very well because people believe in it and get what they need, what they want. This is the apartment on the third floor, and you see, all have their own their own staircase. Look at this. They all got their own staircase. Very important pattern for this user group, for these people. Here's the staircase, you know, your own. And of course, we do all kinds of other things, like we do material experiments to find out what the material we can use, how expensive it is. So those are all experiments that we do all the time so that you actually can create something that is worthwhile doing. If you don't do these experiments, again, if you just do it on paper, well, it's a little risky because you don't, unless you are very experienced, then you may be able to do some, but these experiments are extremely fun, very worthwhile, and great things to do. This project was also a pilot project for a much larger project. This is the Amazon project, and here we see the user participation. This is, by the way, Chris Alexander. The user participation. You can see in our studio how this is done, big models, big plans, and this is a later version where it all looks the same or similar and nothing is the same. That's the most amazing part. When my Frankfurt friend visited me, he was amazed by the variety of what was possible, because he could not imagine that that is possible. And many people will wonder how you do it, you know. It's a lot of work too, you know. So anyway, so this is the Amazon village for 340 housing units. So you can actually build a village like this, even here, that can create a lot of housing for young people, and this is only 3 stories high. And I think that's a very viable project to also for the situation in Poland, because it's not expensive. You can do it in a way that is affordable. And if you use your own labor, your own power, then it's even getting cheaper than otherwise. This is a more typical project that was done in the way that most of the projects today are done. This is, I'm talking about this project that was built. I did later a project with my friend here, but that's not the one I'm talking about, this one here. And it's in Frankfurt Höchst. Do you know the Frankfurt Höchst company? It was a huge company, chemical company that was later sold to Aventis, a French huge conglomerate, but they had their own housing department. And so they developed, this was done with a friend of mine, new housing structure, but this was done more by architects, less by users. And there were like 12 different architects who were all building a particular piece. You can see in the different forms, different styles, how this was actually subdivided. This was our area. So that's another method of how you can do this. You select a number of architects and everybody gets a piece, and then you have to coordinate. You have to work together. That's a very typical way, and these are all 3 to 4 story or higher buildings. This is something that is done in many cities of this 4 to 5 stories, because that's still a height that is not too oppressive and is quite nice for housing areas. So that's another way of approaching this problem. I'm not getting in too much detail. You can see all the experiments again for all kinds of things. And well, maybe you're interested in the apartments again. I'll just give you an example here. You can see again that there are apartments that are unusual. Sometimes an apartment goes into something like this, and sometimes there's an opening. So again, no apartment is the same. They're all different. So this principle is something that we carry through in almost each project, because we don't believe in the application of prototypes that repeat 100 times, 200 times. We don't do that, because it's not a natural thing to do. It's mechanical reproduction, and therefore we don't do it. So also in this project, even though you have archetypes, but the archetype is only the model. Derek's face is only the model. Each other drawing of the face you do will be different from Derek's, because that's how nature works. So that's why this is a very important principle in our work. These are experiments for construction again, and this is something that was built. So you can see how it looks like. And here's my last project. This is a apartment building in the middle of Tokyo, the Emoto apartment building. And this is in an older area. You can see this is an old building with a restaurant at the bottom, and this is a new building that we did there. And this is when I went there and saw this building area for the first time. It was old shacks and run down. And when you look at this here, this is a major street, Shinobasidori in Tokyo. And when you build at the edges of this large street, you can build high. But if you go to very small streets like this, you have to go down, because it's based on the width of the street, how high you can go with the building. So it's a very simple rule, but it's very effective. And here I show you the sequence, how you design this building in a very complicated, irregular shape. And there are many more steps. I just show you 5 steps. So the first thing you do, in order to form the wall, or the volume, you just follow the surroundings of the lot. The second one is, because you need a little space for the entrances, you set back a little bit, but also at the same time, you form a courtyard, because this is south here. This is the south side, so the sun comes inside. The next one is, you form this particular area so it becomes more differentiated. It almost becomes like a pagoda. And then another step is that you have these little gardens with the little entrance houses, because the Japanese, they need front areas where they change their shoes. You probably know that. And these little houses are the entrances where you change your shoes. So this would be a sequence, and if I show you a sequence more and more, you will can understand the whole design of the building based on these structural principles. And this principle is called, I haven't talked about it yet, structure preserving transformation. And it follows very clear rules in terms of geometrical application. This is in a model. This was so tight we couldn't actually do much staking out of the side, so we had to use a model more. This is the south side where the sun comes out. This is the owner's place, of course. And here you see the floor plans. It looks like, what's going on? Now, the same thing is going on that I was telling you about before. The principle is very simple. You have, this is if I think of it as an archetype, you come into, this is the little garden of this unit. You go into the little entrance house where you change the shoes. Then you come in the dining kitchen area, then is the bath next to it, and there's always one tatami room. Each apartment, in all kinds of different shapes, has a minimum of those 4 elements. They happen everywhere. When you look, for example, let me just show you another example. This apartment here, there's another entrance house. Then there's the dining kitchen. Then there's the restroom. This has a bathroom and a restroom. And then you have one room that is actually more Western because there's another room that is in tatami. So these got one more room, and then they can be more free about how they could also make it a tatami room. But you can see that the archetype always includes a tatami room, but then there are other things possible. So even in this building, we followed the same tradition, and in this case, extremely different versions appeared because of the total irregularity of the building. But it was quite fascinating to do that because it made sense, and the Japanese culturally completely understood, of course, what they were getting. We try to be culturally correct, if you want to put it that way. Now, one more thing is interesting. I told you that we do a lot of work on the site. Now, in this case, this is the surrounding. In this case, I'm doing an experiment about the wall. Now, this wall, the experiment is like, well, it should be concrete. There should be some ornament. And I didn't like it. It was not good at all. Because when you make these experiments, the one thing is very important to understand. You learn what not to do. You may not know what to do, but if you learn what not to do, then you at least don't do that mistake. And that's very important also to understand. So, in the end, this was scrapped, and this became actually a yellow terrazzo that was a lot more pleasant. Here you see the yellow terrazzo here, and then you have together with a wooden window and the white of the entrance zone, and this is a special volcanic stone that has a nice color and it's rather light, that also creates an overall composition in terms of a field of centers. That's what we call that, so that you always can be creative in this. There's never a moment that is boring in terms of, oh, it's just work. You know, there's always something interesting to do. I have one more project, but I think I'm going to probably stop here because it's already late. It's another form of home. It's a shelter for the homeless that we built in San Jose in California and Silicon Valley. Can we stop here? Is that okay? Can I just go to the end? Is that okay with you? It's very interesting. Okay, well then I'll show it to you. Okay, so the shelter for the homeless in San Jose is here published in an article of the progressive architecture, the real meaning of architecture, and it is based on a pattern language again. I'll show you here the patterns: entrance transition, living courtyard, communal dining, private sleeping stall, entrance fountain, thick walls, and benches. At the bottom of the buildings, let me just explain just one or two of those. When you have homeless people, other neighbors don't want to see them on the street. If they are hanging out on the street, it's a nuisance in the neighborhood. It's not liked to do that. And so what are you going to do about that? Because they also have to be there. I mean, either they are there or not. So what you do is you find a courtyard, an entrance courtyard that we are called here the entrance transition, that makes it possible, and that has some benches with it, where people can hang out during the day because they are not supposed to be in the building all day long because it's a shelter. A shelter means you only can go there for getting food in the evening or the afternoon, and they can sleep there. In the mornings you can take a shower and so on, but you cannot stay there all day long. And that's why this movement is going on all the time, but you have to also make sure that they can actually be there without disturbing the neighborhood too much, you know. So that's where this pattern comes from. Very simple, very straightforward. Another pattern is, here are the sleeping rooms. And do you see these little subdivisions here? Do you know what that is? Well, it's another pattern because the homeless people, they said, they do not want to sleep just in this endless rows of beds. That's unpleasant, and they want to have their own little space, you know. So the pattern became, they get their little spaces, you know. And that works, just little subdivisions, can be just a piece of cloth, you know, but that's what they wanted, and that's what we gave them, because that was very important to them in order to feel good. And then that's what you do. If it's important to them, you do it, if you can, you know. And so that's another important pattern. And let me go to something else so we can, yeah, I showed this already, I explained this already. And this is something interesting. That was just done for the homeless people. This is their eating room, dining room. And Johanna, you are not an architect, so can I ask you what that structure, that nice truss structure is made of? What is this made of? Anybody knows? No, not this one. Cardboard, that's right. It's an experiment. It's an experiment in order to see if this is a good structure to pursue. And then it was developed in finite element analysis, which at the time was the most advanced way of calculating structural frameworks, because it works like a weaving, where every element can be calculated in ways how it contributes to the structural safety. That was a new method that was not possible before. So all these numbers mean something. They are connections. So to make that strong, and that's there are different ways, there are different designs, you know. And in the final analysis, this one was selected because it was the most engineering-wise successful design, but also aesthetically in terms of field of centers. And here you see the difference, because you are right, in the end it's concrete, you know. At the beginning, this is, you can see, you can feel that this is cardboard or some kind of board. It's not, it doesn't, but you can also feel that, wow, this is solid stuff, you know. And do you know how the concrete was getting up there? It was not, do you know how the concrete was made? Yes, by the shotgun, no? You know, yeah. So the concrete was actually shot into a formwork, and then it was scrapped, and that was the way it was produced. A very unusual structure, but it was a present to the homeless people, because this is expensive to do, but we did it for free, you know, so that was not something that had to be paid for. Mike, that I didn't have to be paid for, sorry. This goes back to the phases again. Derek's phases becoming important again, because these are all the tiles that were used within the concrete structure of the face of the building. And these are some early designs that were tested. There were other designs that were tested. These are all tests. Which one is the best? Remember the question, which one is better, which one is good? That you ask yourself all the time. And in the end, this is the design. Now, can somebody explain to me how this is done? How is this done? Well, first of all, it's done by hand. It's obvious because it's not so sharp. And second, you use a brown color and you paint it on the concrete tile. It's not burnt, it's just a color, but a color that lasts. And there are about 800 tiles on there. So how do you get 800 tiles into this building? Are you going to paint 800 tiles? How are you going to do that? Because they're all different. Each one is different. Based on the same archetype again, but each one is different. So how is this going to happen? Well, since we are university professors, we ask our students to help us, so they can pay, everybody gets 20 or 30, and they painted it based on the archetypal structure, and then you place them, and then you have 800, I think it's 830 or something, and then you have a whole wall full of the same archetype, but everyone is different. And that creates a very interesting structure that is based on communal engagement, communal activity, because we couldn't ask the users here, the homeless people, they were not in a position to do that, so our students were helping us. And in addition, we did also some tiles for the fountain in order to make a nice place for the homeless people. So we were passionate about providing them something nice. That was the motivation. And with that, I think we are at the end. Let me come back to the flower opening, the unfolding wholeness. I think you understand now more what this means, the unfolding wholeness with the archetype and phenotype. This one I think we can leave out for now. That's a very philosophical statement. But I just want to talk about in the end, about 3 areas that I was talking this morning also about in the National Housing Project, that it would be actually a good idea to think about different paths of how to create housing, affordable housing for the people. There are many different ways and we have to explore all of them. Then the second one is that maybe there should be a think tank that should research much more relevant questions that are relevant for the whole country. And the last one is to explore pilot projects that can be demonstrative. They can demonstrate how things can be done, but they also can be, some of them can be more experimental to find out what is good and what is not good. So those are just 3 ideas that I was presenting, we were discussing this morning, just to bring it back to what the overall large project in Poland is about, because in the end, it has to be all useful for that project. That is a huge project for all of Poland in a way that it will affect all of you, because it's just too big. It's just a huge project with millions of units that maybe not all will be built very quickly, but in the next 10, 15 years, you will participate and see lots of very, very important projects changing the landscape of housing in Poland. And with that, I want to end with this picture. Food is like housing done by ourselves or expensive. This is at my family table with my wife and my son and a friend. And since you had this very fantastic title, I thought I need to finish with a picture like this. And with that, I would like to thank you. And sorry for it took a little long. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hajo, for the lecture. Any questions? Pytania do naszego gościa?
The question was about the construction, how it was made, how thick was this paper, and what was the construction of this concrete, finally?
Ornament part in the shelter.
Oh, the shelter, yes.
How thick was the structure?
Okay, so were they made of reinforced concrete?
The measurements of this concrete.
The first floor was made of concrete. The second part was made of wood as a main structure, and outside it was then plastered with concrete plaster, and then the tiles were set in, the concrete tiles themselves.
The trusses, this thing which you did with black cardboard first and the final element.
Oh yeah, yeah. Those were also made of concrete with shotcrete. You know, there's a method where you create a formwork and then you shoot in the concrete from one side. It dries very quickly, so you have to be very fast to scrap it off. But you can actually do it in situ. You can do it in the spot, because it is a very dry concrete that doesn't use too much water, and you shoot it in there, and it immediately creates this truss within the formwork. The preparation takes much more time than the shooting itself. And of course, there's also reinforced steel inside, otherwise it wouldn't hold, you know, obviously. Yeah. It's a very interesting way of doing a truss, because it hasn't been done before in ways that...
How thick?
Oh, very thin, of course. Like this is like 5-6 inches wide, you know. So, yeah, it's not. And then, of course, that's why you saw the horizontal steel bars going from one truss to the other, so that it's because there's earthquake conditions in California, and you have to take care of that too, you know. Mostly this kind of method is used for swimming pool construction. You make a hole and then you shoot the walls, and then you make the walls and put the water in, and that's mostly what it's used for. In this case, you also can use it more creatively, you know. You can do it here too, no problem.
I wanted to ask a question about the pattern language rule and the rules you mentioned you are using in your designs, because for me basically it was like an architectural cookbook, so you had dozens of rules, sometimes which can work together, sometimes in my opinion not. And how actually choose them, which are more important in this particular design and which cannot be applied, because you cannot always use all of them actually.
Well, as I said before, you have to invent new ones. In each project, you don't just use them, you have to invent new ones that work together, because there's no project where you can just use the ones that are there. There are always some new ones. And that's very good, because that means you can be creative about it, and you can actually change patterns that don't work in your way and make it work, you know. And then it may not be called a pattern language anymore, then you call it a project language, because you do things that they are not based on scientific investigation. But that's just a technical term, you know, to do this well. And also, even there, I want to repeat, patterns are archetypal structures, and then they appear in many different phenotypes. So there are thousands of ways of applying them in different ways. It's hardly a situation where they don't fit, because you always can come up with some form that works in this way. When you let's say you have the pattern entrance transition. Well, there's thousands of ways to do an entrance transition as a phenotype, but as an archetypal formulation, it's one clear thing. When you have an entrance transition, you should not just come from the street and, like here, you move right into the building, but you should have a way where this actually, well, this is a public building, so this might be more appropriate, but in a private house, you should have ways that slowly move you in so that you feel more public on the street side, and then slowly you get into the private zone. And that can mean different surface, or you go this way, then this way, and then it's entrance. It's never something straight into the building. And that's the rule of the entrance transition, and there you can imagine there are endless ways of doing that. You know. And that's a pattern that works in many cultures. You know.
I have a question, another question. I asked a lot of questions yesterday, but another one. About creating new patterns. I mean, what are the rules for creating good working patterns? How to create new ones? Are there, is there a set of rules?
Well, the rules are very simple. If you want to have a pattern that can be accepted as a pattern, you have to follow the rules of what each pattern is made of. If it's an analytical rule, then you have to use analysis, mathematics, and prove it logically. And there's the pattern about the T-junctions. It's a purely analytical rule. You can look it up. It's based on logic, on mathematical logic. And then other people have to agree to it. If people, at least you got a statistical average that counts, that's what's important in science, that enough people agree with it, that is actually good. Analytically, well, I mean, it's hard to not agree with logic, but that's more relevant for empirical-based patterns where you need more strong opinions of something. Something is better than something else. The entrance transition, for example, is based on empirical evidence that people actually agree with this pattern. And if you have you have a set of 25 at least that counts scientifically, and the majority of that, a significant majority, not just 51% to 49%, but it has to be at least 75% they agree with it, then it can be accepted as a pattern. And those are the two main ways of actually doing that. And if you want to create new patterns, you have to go through this procedure. If you can't go through this procedure, but you're still convinced about it, then you call it a project language, because it's a language that is using that format, but it's not really tested to the fullest. It's still valid because it's based on some actual research, but it's not fully proven yet. So there are some people who do their PhD on one pattern, prove it scientifically for a whole year, and I can't wait that long. I have my PhD, I don't need another PhD. So when I develop a pattern language, it's quite often a project language. I just have developed a pattern language for earthquake escape along the Oregon coast, because we have a lot of earthquakes and there's a big problem how to make people safe. And that is based then on particular evidence within the sequence of how people can escape, you know. And that I did for the state government of Oregon. So I call it a project language for the escape in earthquake situations. Right now I'm working on a pattern language for refugees in Europe, and that's a more tricky one. I got into it, but I realized this is not so easy to do. But I'm in the middle of that, so I can't tell you the results of it. But I think I will have it done by September. So then I can show you the results. Right now I'm working on one cluster that deals with a refugee family, because a refugee family is totally different than the family in the pattern book. There are patterns about families in the pattern book that you can look at, but when you deal with a refugee family, it's a totally different situation, totally different pattern. And so that's what I'm currently doing in terms of patterns. But they give you a real basic framework to understand the situation in terms of activities that you have to do in order to get something right and help the people. Yes, Klaus?
Yeah, maybe another aspect of the patterns is if you think about a cooperative which wants to do something together, and wants to discuss about architecture. From what I understand, and maybe comment on this a bit, Hajo, is often people have difficulties to speak about architecture. Someone says, I like this, the other one says, I like that, and it's very hard to get beyond liking. I understand if you have a group of people, they can actually do a pattern for what they want to do. If they want to create their house and they have a particular idea, they can try to formulate this in a pattern where they start from a problem definition and then they have something to talk about rather than looking at pictures and saying I like it or I don't like it, because that can very quickly be frustrating. That's also sort of, for me, the flip side of the patterns. If you're not an academic or an architect who does it for the large side, for the individual users, it's an instrument to actually create cooperation, create discussion about the thing where you later have to live in.
Yes, that's very correct, because if you have a discussion with a group, there are two problems. One is how do you get the group together, and how do you really find out what they want, you know. So there are two ways. One is you meet together and try to find out some patterns, but a much more effective way is to meet individually, because then you can have a personal discussion and you can get much deeper into what the person really wants. You can talk more in a way that it's more truthful. In a group situation, some people don't talk, others just want to say something because you have to say something. So I only do this when the group is actually, you have to slowly build it up in a group so it really works, you know. The individual discussion is much more effective, and the pattern language for the Asian campus was done in two ways, mostly in terms of these individual discussions. And then somebody, for example, says to you, well, what I really want is a big lawn where everybody can meet. That's what I really want. Before there was all kinds of talk of this and that, and then finally you ask then questions, well, close your eyes and think really what you deeply want, you know, and that works quite often well, you know. Then people say simple things, well, I want to have flowers along the entranceway. And then it gets also complicated things. Well, I want a big hall where everybody can meet, we can have music, and then there's a big pattern, you know. So I think this has to be learned like everything else to really find out what people want, and they have to find out themselves. But just listening to what they like, I mean, that's maybe at the beginning, but that's not reliable. That I would not rely on that. You need to get deeply into what they may not even know at that point what they really like, you know. So it's something you have to learn, but it's learnable. It's not like something. It's not a mystery. But you're completely right. I mean, if you go into the details of it, you really have to know what you're doing. Otherwise, you may do something that is not appropriate. If you just have a session what you like, I'm not relying on that. Derek, you have a question now.
If I can say, how much more time and effort does it, if I can use the word, cost you as an architect to work like this, comparing to the business as usual pattern?
Yes, well, I mean, since we're also connected to the university, we have to do also research, you know. And I consider it quite often very interesting research because if you want to do it professionally only, you have to calculate your time, and it becomes a matter of how it's being paid and so on, which is anyway something that you have to do. But I put a lot of extra time in because I find out something that is very interesting to me, you know. So it's easier when you're connected to a research institution to do this because it's part of your daily work anyway, you know. So, but if you do it in the office, when I do it in the office, well, I still do it, and then it's quite often a lot more work, unpaid work, you know. But as a professor, I earn enough, so it doesn't bother me too much, you know. So, but it's an issue. I mean, you're right. If you're in regular office, you have to find a way. And also you can learn it, and you get actually very good at it, and it becomes shorter and shorter. That at the beginning, to learn it, of course, it's an investment. But more and more, it's in your fingertips. You just do it. And
have any more questions in public, we can finish the official part, and there are still some drinks, cakes, so feel free to enjoy the food and have another talk with our guest. Thank you, Hajo, a lot.
Thank you.